I'm Amanda Leitner, and welcome to Rochester Rising, where we amplify the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs. Welcome to episode 166 of the podcast today. So on the show today, I have the immense pleasure of sharing with you a conversation I had with David Ollila of SkyPoint Ventures. David is a native of Marquette, Michigan, and currently is an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder in Flint, Michigan. And he was the keynote speaker for the RAEDI Annual Meeting and Luncheon last week. David had his first idea for a product as a 7-year-old where he worried about his mother cutting fruit. While that original idea didn't stick, David never stopped tinkering to find solutions. He's a serial entrepreneur and holds 16 patents from everything from sporting goods to wearable technology. He's always thinking about new ideas, and this helped him cultivate entrepreneurship and opportunity in his communities, including in Flint at SkyPoint Ventures, 100K Ideas, and the Ferris Wheel Innovation Center, which he'll talk about on the podcast today. Since he joined SkyPoint as its president and chief innovation officer, he's helped to develop an ecosystem to foster entrepreneurship in the community. He learned very early on in his career that tools, resources, and support are not always available to people on the ground floor. So he set out to change it. He led the charge to develop Ferris Wheel Building into an innovation hub in Flint that many local businesses now call home. He also co-founded 100K Ideas to help passionate innovators create products, services, and startups of their own. Before joining SkyPoint Ventures, he was the founding director of Invent at NMU at Northern Michigan University. This is a nationally recognized innovation and commercialization center at Northern Michigan University, and it helps aspiring inventors get their ideas to the market and spurs economic development in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He started a number of different ventures, including Marquette Backcountry Ski, the first helmet camera, and UP Mountain Biking Magazine. His work has improved local economies and has captured the attention of leaders at all levels, and he has made multiple trips to the White House. So you're in for a real treat today with this conversation with David. As I mentioned, he was the keynote speaker for the RAEDI Annual Luncheon. So I appreciate RAEDI bringing him over to chat with us, supplying us with that wonderful bio that I just read. And David's talk on the podcast today and his talk at the RAEDI Annual Luncheon were a little bit different. So I would definitely encourage you to watch his talk that occurred in Rochester. You can find it on the RAEDI Facebook page. And I'll link the RAEDI Facebook page in our show notes. Unfortunately, I can't link a video, or I don't know how. So if anyone knows how, let me know. But you can find David's video on the RAEDI Facebook page and scroll through to where he started in that presentation. So definitely check it out. What he talked about was a little different than when he talked about on the podcast. So you get the fuller picture of all that he's doing and his message to focus on all the ideas in your community and how you can really empower people in your community to make their lives better for themselves and for their ecosystem. So check it out. A reminder that you can find this podcast in multiple different locations. Of course, you can find it on our website at rochesterrising.org, where we have multiple articles, videos, and podcasts. We actually just started a brand new podcast series called Entrepreneur in Focus. So you can check that out on our website, on our YouTube channel, on Facebook, wherever you link up with us. And it was a wonderful conversation with Michael and Kelly Vernio of Rochester Roadrunners, a semi-professional basketball team that's new to the Rochester area. So check it out there. All right, so now on to the podcast with David Ollila of SkyPoint Ventures. Thanks so much for doing this today and taking time before your talk with RAEDI today in the community.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So I was doing some light LinkedIn stalking of you yesterday and seems like you've always been entrepreneurial. You know, you're a serial entrepreneur, have 16 patents, and started very early. So how did you originally get interested in entrepreneurship, and how did those early experiences kind of shape where you are today?
Sure. I actually, my path to entrepreneurship started more as an inventor. And I believe that these are separate things, inventors, innovators, and entrepreneurs. But I started inventing little, gizmos and widgets when I was about 7 years old, and just continued to do that. And then eventually some of my inventions, people wanted to buy them. And that's kind of where I made this jump from being an inventor into being an innovator. And then when you become an innovator and people are interested in the products that you're creating, that's when entrepreneurship starts to happen. And so that's been basically the process that I've gone through: inventor, innovator, and then entrepreneur. And I'm not really sure what I'm the best at. Probably inventing, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're being an entrepreneur.
We were just having that conversation the other day about what the difference is between innovation and entrepreneurship. And, I don't know that anybody agrees on what the answer is, but to me, it's, having a financial transaction for that product or service. Otherwise, it's great to innovate and invent, but I think that marks the switch in innovation and entrepreneurship.
And when that switch hits, that's when you start to see that there's opportunity to monetize your creativity. And that's the best feeling in the world.
So, did you grow up in the Upper Peninsula in Marquette?
I did.
Okay, so I have been to Marquette, one of the best and worst experiences of my life.
Oh, no, when did you go?
Well, August, but I ran a 50K.
Oh, did you run the Trail 50?
Yes.
Oh, how did that feel?
It was beautiful, but also terrifying because it's like totally different than here. And there were like rock faces and you're running up them in the last 28 miles. So I'm like, I'm going to lose my teeth. I'm just going to fall. But it was wonderful. The people were great. But that's why it was the best and worst experience of my life.
But what's great is you're never going to forget your experience in Marquette. And I know exactly where you were. I know those trails like the back of my hand. And in August, so I can't remember what the weather was like, but was it hot?
I don't remember. I think it was like maybe in the 70s. It wasn't anything.
So not so bad. And the bugs probably weren't bad.
Not that I remember.
And it's just beautiful terrain. But you're right. It can be treacherous at times.
It was so beautiful, though. So I was interested in kind of your experience growing up there. And it sounds like, I'm guessing you really have a passion for the outdoors based on what you've done so far. So what was that like? And what was your experience growing up in Marquette?
Yeah, so I've lived in Marquette kind of twice in two different phases of my life. I was there when I was born in 1970, and then I moved away in 1983. And, my family kind of did a modern day Grapes of Wrath move to San Diego. And then to finish college and to spend time with my grandfather, moved back to Marquette in the early 90s. And that's really when I started thinking about innovation and entrepreneurship as a career path for me. But I've always been enthralled with being outdoors. I feel most creative when I'm outdoors. I feel most comfortable when I'm outdoors. Even today, I don't have the heaviest of jackets on, and there was concern, like, are you going to be able to walk outside?
I say,
no.
From the UP,
If it's cold, for 10 minutes, I might be shivering, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm uncomfortable. So there's a lot of parallels with kind of outdoor recreation and being outdoors, and that you're not always comfortable. So you weren't always comfortable doing a 50K run on the trails, right? But it's now probably one of your lifetime memorable experiences. You've got this, thought about this area that you visited. And really, I think we do the most changing when we are uncomfortable. And I've spent most of my life fluctuating between inventor, innovator, and entrepreneur. And there is always extreme uncomfortable situations as you're trying to come up with the funding, as you're trying to figure out what the value proposition is, as you're trying to stumble your way through some invention and you just can't get it right. So a lot of, I think, the benefit of coming from Marquette and being outside is being okay in nature. And as an entrepreneur, it's in my nature to take risk and to try to monetize that risk. And so I see a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think like the immersion in nature for entrepreneurship, it also, I've heard a lot of people in business say when they're running or doing things outdoors, they're really thinking about business and really working through some things. It's actually the complete opposite for me. That's like the only time I turn my brain off, like the only time. So, which is also extremely valuable to just have that experience and be thinking about nothing.
I think the hardest part for people with active minds, which I certainly am, conflicted with, that is how do you turn the brain off? And that's another parallel. I've done a lot of action sports, and those are the only moments where I can really be in the moment, because most of the time I'm dreaming of what's around the corner, which means you're inside of your head and you're trying to visualize, the next 5 steps. It's kind of like nobody wins playing pool, shooting one ball at a time. You have to be able to leave that cue ball set up for another area. And it's kind of like chess, the same thing. No one wins playing chess one move at a time. You're perseverating through all of the potential, all of the possibilities, and all the scenarios. But being outside, being in nature, exercising, being on your bike or skiing or snowmobiling, whatever that might be, really are the moments when I'm in the moment, which frees me from being an entrepreneur or an innovator. Every once in a while, you slip back into that role, of course, but then you trip on a route and you're like, okay, you have to focus here.
Yes, that is what I focus on, especially trail running. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed my time in Marquette. Would love to go back again someday. I'm sure it's in the cards. It's not that far from here.
Yeah, it's not a bad place to go.
No, it's beautiful. So while you were in Marquette, you worked on Invent NMU and then transitioned to Flint, Michigan in 2016. So can you talk a little bit about your time there and kind of that move to Flint and what drew you to that region?
Sure. So Marquette's a very comfortable place, and it's a bubble. And sometimes you forget that you're actually living on the planet when you're up in Marquette, Michigan. I had started to think for a while about this concept of how do you relieve the innovator of the entrepreneurial burden. So entrepreneurship is really, really hard, especially for the uninitiated. And we know as a fact that the earlier you start practicing entrepreneurship, the more likely you will be a successful entrepreneur. But the way that it's kind of served up in the country is you almost have to wait until you've achieved something before you actually get to participate, which means many, many people don't have that on-ramp to participation. So as I was sitting in Marquette and I had this epiphany one day, and I realized that all of my startups, all of the products that I've created, the services that I've brought to market had one thing in common, and that was college students were always my first hires. I have found that I can get more done with a small cohort of college students than I can with seasoned professionals. They're not afraid to fail. They have nothing to lose because they have everything in front of them. They're incredibly creative, but most important, they're subject matter experts in the things that they're studying, but they've not had the ability to exercise those things. So taking that concept into play and knowing that I had this theory that everyone has an idea, but not everyone is an entrepreneur. And so I went to Northern Michigan University, and I convinced them to give me $500,000, 5,000 square feet, and 5 students. And we opened up essentially an innovation center for the community that was located like a retail store off campus, so it was very easily accessible to the community. And in a town of 21,000 people, almost instantaneous, one new idea comes in the door every 3 days.
That's a lot for
it's
that
a
size
lot of
a
ideas
city or community. Yeah.
And it's not students, it's young people, it's old people, it's people working in the trades, it's stay-at-home parents, it's the end users who are coming up with these ideas. And it's not about the most grandiose innovation centers. It's because you're not going to get inclusion when you're only looking at, for the Rochester perspective, if you're only looking at medical, well, then you're taking out the majority of the population who have ideas that want to participate. They don't have that skill set. They don't have the experience. They don't have necessarily the college degrees or a PhD, but they're really creative and they have ideas that could be complementary, but there's not enough of an on-ramp there. So in Marquette, we created this place which allowed anyone to walk in off the street with their idea and start pursuing that. And shortly after we opened, Governor of Michigan at the time, Rick Snyder, paid us a visit and pulled me aside and said, can we replicate this throughout the state? Which turned into the mission to say, actually, the first place that we should go is Flint, because that's the place in Michigan that is infamous right now around the water crisis. But more important than the water crisis, not to undermine that, is that was a community that had been falling for a number of years when General Motors pulled out and left an entire population of a city without jobs and without the ability to create new economic opportunities. And it was really a disparaging look at what the country is. So Flint, Michigan doesn't just represent Flint, Michigan. It represents so many of these areas throughout the country that have failing infrastructure and failed social obligations and failed politics, that it was one of those things where, some people run out of a burning building and some people run in. And this was an opportunity to run into a burning building and to get uncomfortable and then to leave my cozy little planet of Marquette, Michigan, and go to Flint, where I felt like I could make a bigger impact with greater purpose.
Yeah, I actually grew up in Pittsburgh, and my whole family was in the steel industry. So, you talk about a industry that dies, and then what does the community do? And Pittsburgh survived, but, some of the smaller communities, like in West Virginia and more of the Rust Belt, when that went away, it just was devastating.
Terribly devastating.
So, but I think, you bring up an extremely important point in that a lot of the times when we think of entrepreneurship, we think of these high growth potential, highly scalable startups, whereas, anything that adds value to a person's life, whether it's just pursuing a passion, rising out of a social economic status, finding more freedom and flexibility, that's extreme, and solving a need, whatever that gap is, that's extremely valuable. Whatever that innovation is that finds a home with customers.
Sure.
And sometimes I feel like we forget that.
And it's valuable to the community, but also for the individual, because it gives that individual purpose and purpose around something that they're passionate about. Spent just a few hours now last night and then this morning getting a little bit of understanding of the scope of the economic development entrepreneurial support ecosystems here in Rochester. And one of the statistics that's hitting me like a ton of bricks is that 40% of Rochester's population is earning less than the average household income. And so you said this, it doesn't have to be the most grandiose startup that's going to have a $1 billion exit. Actually, my theory, my process is if you could double the average household income by adding $50,000 of a side hustle that turns into a business, and not measure how many jobs are created when a big conglomerate comes to town, but how many people actually quit their job because now they're rowing their own boat. And that's when I think you start to build the density required to create a truly diverse economy that includes everyone who has an idea.
Yeah, totally agree. And then the challenging part is, how do you measure success, especially if it's not jobs, because I don't think that's the right metric for early stage entrepreneurial communities.
No, I mean, so, I always look at the inverse. So again, taking an analogy of being outdoors, right? So if you're riding a mountain bike or you're trail running and you're looking at the trees, you're going to run into them.
Yes.
You actually need to look at the spaces around the obstacle. So a graphic designer would call that the negative space. And there's value in the negative space. And so you have to actually look for those opportunities from an unusual perspective that give people something to strive for.
So you learned a little bit about the Rochester entrepreneurial ecosystem yesterday and more today, but when you got to Flint in 2016, what did the ecosystem look like there, and who were your entrepreneurs?
So that was one of the most eye-opening experiences that I think I've ever had. So I've been there for about 4 years now, and Flint was starting to turn, I think, for the better before I actually got there. There was a number of stakeholders within the community that were making investments, keeping restaurants going even though they weren't profitable, trying to get that second turn or the third turn of tables. So there was a number of people and organizations that were keeping the light on, and obviously the Mott Foundation is a huge huge national foundation that's based in Flint. And so there was activity and there was action, but it needed just a little bit more to activate the downtown area and then eventually spread that into some of the neighborhoods surrounding Flint. There's no question in a town like Flint, everyone has an idea. And again, that's kind of this model is if you look at the ideas versus entrepreneurship, you can start to cultivate that. So when I got there, I was tasked with renovating a 7-story, 40,000 square foot building that had been sitting empty smack dab in the middle of downtown Flint for 35 years. And next to that building was the building that Billy Durant formed General Motors. And I'm in that office building. Mm-hmm. That building also sat empty for 35 years. So Flint was really forgotten and left to decay. And you see the activity happening here in Rochester. Rochester wasn't forgotten like Flint was, but I think I've counted 5 cranes in the city right now rebuilding this infrastructure because every community in the United States actually needs a bit of a refresh. Or I would say that a large portion of communities in the United States need a pretty significant refresh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you started or were involved in a lot of important ventures in Flint, including SkyPoint Ventures, Ferris Wheel, and 100K Ideas. So what need did each of these play to fill gaps you saw in Flint, and what kind of makes up a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Right. So you need density, you need diversity, and you need that full spectrum. So you do need efforts looking at those big opportunities, and that's important. And so from the SkyPoint Ventures perspective, my title there is I'm the president and the chief innovation officer. And essentially I'm managing a portfolio of investment companies that have some very big opportunities, but they also take an incredible amount of resources, an incredible amount of risk, and quite a bit of runway to be able to make those things happen. That's important. But it's the second and third tier entrepreneurial activities that I believe are the most important. So the Ferris Wheel is very much like sitting in Collider here. Mm-hmm. It is a co-working space. It's a little bit bigger. It's the 7 stories, 40,000 square feet.
A little bit bigger.
But there's about, in Flint, there's 87% occupancy of that co-working space, which is actually pretty significant. There's about 60 companies operating in there. Some of them are startups and some of them are 50 years old. And some of them come from surrounding community to bring those opportunities into Flint. So the Ferris Wheel Innovation Center has essentially created kind of the culture or what I call the new town square, and it pulls people in and gets them excited about what's happening. And that's kind of that mid-tier that you build out. And then 100K, and I'd be lying if I didn't say this was the most exciting part of what I'm doing, because it's really my model of, again, how do you relieve the innovator of the entrepreneurial burden? And as I mentioned, in Marquette, Michigan, at Invent NMU, you have one new idea coming in the door every 3 days. In Flint, Michigan, a town of about 100,000 people, it's up to 3 ideas a day. And on a good week, we might have 5 to 10 ideas that come through the door from the absolute unusual suspects. I think our youngest client is 13 years old and our oldest client is 94 years old. And it's everything in between. That starts to build the energy and this concept that there's opportunities for everyone to figure out how to get into the world of entrepreneurship in a somewhat supported way. And the combination of kind of those 3 things are attracting new capital to the community. And so an angel group has been formed, and we're on the radar of the Michigan Venture Capital Association. And it's also, I think, one of the things that Flint has done that's very, very interesting from a state perspective is there's a lot of silos. I'm sure you have silos here in Minnesota, and especially in Michigan. So, when people think of Michigan, they think of Detroit.
Yep.
But Detroit has its own culture and its own mass. Mm-hmm. And then you have Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids survived the downturn of the automobile industry because of its density and diversification in its economic development. It wasn't just automobiles. It was furniture, automobiles, manufacturing, manufacturing, and medical. And so Grand Rapids is a really interesting community to take a look at and how you can insulate yourself from up and downs of the economy. But you also have Lansing, and you have Kalamazoo, and then you have all of the stuff happening on the northern part of the state, and then you have the UP. So one of the things I think we've been able to do that's I'm very proud of is Flint has now become a aggregator of the smartest, brightest, or the people with the most energy willing to be and work in uncomfortable situations. And I really think that we're pulling people together. And that's a role that I didn't necessarily see happening. But it's also symbolic of the fact that states like Michigan, states like Minnesota have diversified economies. Doesn't mean that you have to separate your communities.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was actually reading a great story on Flint entrepreneurs yesterday. I think I was about 3 years old at this point in Inc. You probably read it. But yeah, it was just the breadth of like the different types of entrepreneurs. There was some lady, I can't remember what the name of the business was, but it was like gourmet potatoes, baked potatoes.
Yeah.
And like
Spuds.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was thinking Spudsy, but that's on a TV show.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, just like an idea that was a need that filled something that previously used to have been there and kind of take it to the next level. And there is something, an entrepreneur clothing, good boy clothing.
Oakland.
Yeah,
and he's in our space and doing a fantastic job.
Yeah, so just, these people filling a need, pursuing some passions, and, making their lives and the lives of people around them better. So
and willing to do all of the work that's necessary.
Yep. And I think that's a gap in our community here that we need to fill is we do better working with people when they're past that idea stage, but that idea stage is what fuels the pipeline. So, we have 1 million cups, but you're beyond idea stage usually at that point. Mm-hmm. So, what can we do in this community that fills that need where we have, 2 people a day walking in the door to talk about their idea and where do they land? So I think that's something we need to address in the near future to help with the pipeline and help with diversification of our economy to, like you were saying, help insulate it from, and Rochester was largely insulated from, the 2012 recession, but I think we can do better, for our entrepreneurs and our, community.
The great thing about concentrating on ideas is the barrier is very, very low. And so, yes, you're going to look at a lot of really bad ideas, but my whole life has been built on a lot of really bad ideas and a few good ones. And an interesting statistic that I like to share. So at 100K ideas, the average person who comes in is holding their idea for up to 5 years before they're willing to share it. And as an entrepreneur myself and as someone who's been practicing it almost my whole life, I didn't realize how important courage was within this process. It was, I'm completely obtuse to the fact that it would take courage to start something. It's just in my nature. And so what happens is these folks are holding their ideas like it's a lottery ticket. Mm-hmm. I've got an idea. I've heard about this pet rock, this one idea that's made all sorts of money. And so instead of scratching off the lottery ticket, what people do is they hold on to it. So they keep going to the job that they don't love, and they keep going through the life that they don't love or that doesn't challenge them or doesn't give them the kind of passion that's necessary to really create change for themselves and those around them. If I scratch off those numbers, I'm going to know that this idea is not worth pursuing. And then I will not be able to dream about becoming a multimillionaire and living on an island somewhere. So it's actually very detrimental to the community to have people holding on to ideas. So Rochester has a little over 100,000 people within the population. I know without any doubt that every single person is walking around with an idea, and over 60% of them are afraid to share it because that idea might not get them this grandiose vision of what an entrepreneur is. And so they're actually more willing to hold on to the dream than to activate the dream. The process has to be that the very moment you have an idea is when you start pursuing that idea, and you stop pursuing it as soon as you realize it doesn't have the value that's necessary to create an ongoing entrepreneurial endeavor. And you know what happens? 25% of the people that come in and realize that their lottery ticket should have been scratched off 5 years ago, they come back in with a new idea, then they come in with another idea, and that's how you activate the base density of innovation and turn it into entrepreneurial economic development.
Yeah. So you've been entrepreneurial pretty much your whole life and helping people pretty much your whole life. So why are you passionate about this? What drives you to get up and do this every day?
Gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I think my wife and my family appreciate this the most, in that I am not happy unless I'm incredibly challenged. And I think that becomes part of the nature of entrepreneurship or being an innovator is, well, I'll put it back on you. Why would you run a 50K trail run?
The challenge.
Right? Did you know you could do it?
I was pretty confident that I could, but I actually ran it with my husband, and he did not finish it. So,
And so, how many times do you rub that in?
Not much, pretty much never.
You save it. That's great. But that's the exact analogy right there. Is that I have the confidence to know that I can figure out some of these problems. And it started at a very early age. If we were getting in trouble in the neighborhood, I would kind of stand in front of my friends and say, I'll do the talking. And so there's a gift, I think, that's within that. That's part of my DNA. I don't know why I like the underdog so much, but personally, I would rather lose with the upper hand, and I would much more be pleased with taking second place as an underdog and battling the kind of the incumbent and the large position holders. So for some reason, this has become my life work. I feel like I'm really good at encouraging people to take that step of an idea, to pursue it, to find out if it could become an invention, to find out if that changes people's behavior, and then is an innovation, and then becomes entrepreneurial opportunity for them. I think most importantly, though, if I knew what I was going to do tomorrow, I would be very bored, and I'm not happy when I'm bored, and I need to be challenged. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
I think that's a fair answer. All right, I have some final questions to take us to the end, as we're nearing the end of your time. What are you reading or listening to right now?
Oh, gosh, good question. Well, I'll tell you what, I didn't read, but I watched it on Netflix, and I think everyone should watch The American Factory, a documentary that was produced by the Obamas. It takes place in Dayton, Ohio, where a General Motors plant was shuttered, and then a Chinese business person made an investment. I think the takeaway on that is that no one's doing it right. And we only know what we know. And I don't think that we have enough of a empathy towards other cultures and process and understanding how we are as a global entity versus a community entity. And I thought that was kind of an eye-opening experience. And then, of course, I always go back to my favorites, which, is Ayn Rand was a pretty big driver with The Fountainhead and with Atlas Shrugged, about what it is really like to kind of take accountability for your actions and try to improve the world, and do it in a way where it's not 100% altruistic. But my life, I've been blessed with so many interesting opportunities and entrepreneurial experiences and the ups and downs with it, that I've been able to lead a better life than the average person, as far as like the 40% of the city here that's earning less than $50,000 a year. And I actually did that by creating a business that earned $25,000 a year. That was the first business that I started. It was a low-tech printed magazine promoting mountain biking in the UP of Michigan. And I'm in the same business today. I'm telling stories, I'm negotiating, I'm building a supply chain, I'm screwing up, and then I'm fixing it. So I don't know if that was the perfect answer to the question, but I think that's the kind of the path.
What's your favorite thing to do in your spare time?
Spare time.
If you have spare time.
Yeah, I tinker. I have a garage with a lot of tools in that garage. And so if I'm not fully engaged at something I'm doing at work, I start building something. Can't help it, can't stop. But if I'm, wake up on a Saturday morning, I'm going to go into the garage if there's nothing really on my plate. After exercise, after getting outside, if I have, which is very important, I will start tinkering and building things.
My final question for you, where can people find out more about you and what's going on in your community?
Yeah. So if you Google or if you go to 100kideas.org, it's a good place to start. The Ferris Wheel Innovation Center. This is going to sound horrible, but if you Google me, you'll see some of these articles that come up. I've been, again, blessed with this very Forrest Gump type life. And what I've realized that if you show up, you participate, you become a driver in something, you will get random invitations to do things that really give you the opportunity to shape the world. So the last thing I want to do is exit from that and hide. I want to get out there and get as much exposure as I possibly can because I really want to leave a dent on this planet. And if I could choose what kind of dent that is to create this awareness that you can row your own boat, that you can start a business that might only make $25,000 the first year and $50,000 the second year. And that is the average household income. So I want to encourage everyone that has an idea to start pursuing that idea, but very importantly, not by creating a business plan, by actually building the product and seeing if someone's interested in buying it. And as soon as you find someone that's willing to pay for your work is when the business develops from there. And I want to encourage the planet to do that.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation today and sharing your insight, experience, and your community with us. And looking forward to hearing your talk later today in a few hours here at the RAEDI Luncheon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm completely impressed with the ecosystem in Rochester and the folks who are genuinely working really hard to make sure that everyone has a chance to participate, and also leveraging kind of the giants in your community because they play a very, very integral, important part, but also allowing people to break out of that gravity and create a constellation rather than a soul planet.
Yeah, very true. Well, thank you for this conversation today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to David for taking time during his stop in Rochester to sit down and chat with us. You can find more information about 100K Ideas, SkyPoint Venture, and the Ferris Wheel Innovation Center through the links in our bio that we provided or from the information David provided. So check it out. And again, you can find the other part of David's talk from the RAEDI Annual Meeting and Luncheon on the RAEDI Facebook page. So I highly encourage you to check it out and listen in to this important message for the Rochester entrepreneurial ecosystem. We are always looking for great Rochester-based entrepreneurs to have on the podcast. So if you know someone with a great story to share, let us know. Send us an email at rochesterrising@gmail.com. The best way to stay up to date with all of our podcasts, our stories, our videos is definitely to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. It comes out every Sunday morning through our partner organization or our sister organization, Collider, which is the nonprofit that we are a part of. So check it out. You'll not only get up to date with all of our latest stories, but also the events and educational offerings taking place in the Rochester entrepreneurial ecosystem. So you can sign up on our website. So check it out. That's a wrap for the podcast today. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the Rochester Rising podcast wherever you listen in to your podcast content so that you never miss a story of innovation and entrepreneurship coming out of Rochester, Minnesota. We'll be here next Wednesday with a brand new episode.